We're continuing our series called All the Voices and how the sheep are supposed to know the shepherd's voice, but yet it seems like so many of us struggle with hearing his voice, listening to his voice, recognizing his voice, knowing that he knows our name and all the things. So today's is called Run Away. We've established that Jesus is the only way and that he has to be established as the only way in order to hear his voice above all others, that he knows our names, he's a personal God and he's calling us, and that we need to be listening. And now we're moving on to the part in chapter 10 of the book of John that says the sheep will never run away because they won't recognize the voice of a stranger. That's in verse 5. My dad was a loan officer for years, and he told us this story very often of how they were taught to recognize counterfeit bills. I would think that you would touch counterfeit bills in order to see what they feel like, but it was just the opposite. The employees were put in a vault with nothing but real money, and they were told to feel it for hours, I think maybe even days. After that, the real money had passed over their hands so long that when a counterfeit bill showed up, they immediately recognized it. I thought that was so interesting. So since we're talking about all the voices we hear and how to distinguish his voice above the sea of all the voices, it would seem that that would occur by hanging out and listening to and reading what his voice says. This would enable us to run away from the strangers' voices, those thieves and robbers that come to climb over the sheep pen and destroy the sheep. But where we get into trouble very often is when we listen to the voice of strangers to see if we like what they're saying and if they might offer us additional truth before we run, and that can be dangerous. We mentioned the story of Jonah in the last series, but what made him run away? It seemed like he did not like the character of God and his compassion for others, so he ran away, and he ended up being a bitter man, so it seemed. But if we belong to the shepherd and we recognize what he's done for us by laying down his life, we're aware that he knows our name, we listen to his voice. This verse says that we will never run away because we won't recognize the voice of a stranger. One familiar story of a runaway son or sheep is the prodigal son story, but let's look closer in light of recognizing and listening to and knowing the father or the shepherd's voice. You know the story. A father had two sons, and one demanded his inheritance and ran off. In Luke 15, it says several things about him running away. He got together all that he had, he set off for a distant country, and he squandered all his wealth, and he ended up feeding pigs. So what made this sheep-like son want to leave the provision of his father's house? Could it be that he had listened to strangers' voices that cast doubt and suspicion on the safety of staying in the sheep pen? The story is not about growing up and leaving your father. That's not the issue or the lesson to be learned here. It's the story of an attitude and choices when it comes to the relationship between the shepherd and the sheep, or father and son. Apparently this son wanted to claim all he had and call it his and use it for his own purposes. And apparently he had heard about other exciting, we'll say, pens, so that he could visit them, and he began despising the surroundings his father provided. And apparently this son had learned nothing and didn't want to learn anything on how to manage his provision. All of those voices telling him what he had belonged to him to do with what he wanted, and that the boundaries set for him were restrictive, prompted this sheep to run off. In other words, he recognized the voices and entertained voices of strangers that knew nothing of the Father, but cast doubt on the Father's love, provision, and knowledge and care for his son. The son wanted to care for himself in his own way. Picture with me this sheep pen full of sheep being cared for and protected, but outside there's voices calling the sheep to exit the safety of the pen. They call to all of us, I'd say, including our children, to run away at some point or another. But our main passage in John says that we don't recognize the voice of strangers, so therefore we won't run away. Voices we might listen today are not much different than the ones that this prodigal son heard. We think God owes us and we're entitled to everything we want today. We think that our belongings belong to us to use however we want. And then we fall into an attitude of despising the goodness of God in our lives and entertaining that we can fill ourselves or fill our needs apart from him. We turn away, we run off from the God that loves us, knows us, and invites us to fellowship into a life full of self-indulgence, abandonment of the good, and finding ourselves in another pen, but this time with pigs instead of sheep. Teenagers do this, adults do this, married people do this, all sorts of sheep running away from the good, entertaining voices of strangers, until one day, hopefully, we come to our senses and return home. Why did the son return home? He remembered the provision, he recalled his father's arms that held him, and the slop that he was standing in was so disgusting he was willing to go home and tell his father he was sorry. He humbled himself to the voice of the father who was standing at the doorway, arms wide open to receive him. Cool story, right? We all run away, and we often will, because strangers call and lurk and entice. Or we can turn away and realize the intimacy of the gatekeeper that guards our surroundings, knows our names, and we can choose to listen to his voice.